Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Call It RevOps, and today we're going to be talking about revenue frameworks and why they don't mean four-letter word in the real world. So we've kind of talked a little bit about this before, but the reality is these revenue frameworks are not going to make a single difference in the real world. And why is that? So we'll kind of open it up a little bit, but I wanted to let you, jump right in because I know you have some strong feelings about this.
Yeah, and I'll say it like revenue frameworks don't mean shit in the real world. Any general framework that promises some sort of recurring revenue or some sort of forecastable revenue strategy, whether it be a pillar, whether it be 15 pillars of revenue, or whether it be five boxes of revenue, or whatever variation of that framework, is bullshit. Like it doesn't. It has no sense and no place in the modern day marketing world. Just like lead scoring, and the concept of lead scoring, everyone's generally kind of outgrown it, and that's the main thing, right? When we talk about business and we talk about what these frameworks are intended to do, they're intended that they make promises about predictability and scalability and revenue repeatability. All of those things are very nice. I would love those things. However, they don't exist. They don't exist in the real world, right? It's like eating French fries and expecting to lose weight. Like, look, they taste really good. It's a very good framework of eating every single day, but the reality is that they're designed to sell you something, and they're designed to sell you the idea that revenue is something that is repeatable and scalable. And the reality is that those pathways to revenue encompass so many more micro components than one factor of a revenue framework. And that's, I think, my biggest kind of beef with these frameworks is that they're rigid, they're overly complex, they, don't handle predictability, right? And repeatable and scalable means everything stays the same and everything changes. That's the beauty of marketing technology, just in a nutshell, right? We have to look at those frameworks as a theoretical model. It's a theory of what could potentially work, but it doesn't mean that it's going to work. And that is the big contention with frameworks in the modern day world. The reason RevOps as a job, as a space exists is because theoretical is not cutting it anymore. You have to be practical. You have to focus on execution. You have to look at data. Revenue frameworks don't focus on data. They focus on a theory or the concept or the idea of how you're going to get revenue.
Well, and I think that's kind of one reason why frameworks do more harm than good because they're rooted in the theory. There's no real kind of foundation in reality. And then that kind of leads, I think, nicely into our next segment where we'll talk about the reasons why they do more harm than good. And I think one of them, and you kind of hinted at this a little bit, but the predictability component. They kind of assume that growth when it comes to revenue is going to be a linear process. It's always going to be this is the way you're going to do. If you implement these five pillars or, check these five boxes, growth is going to be linear.
Well, they also ignore context, right? They also talk about like what framework applies for what company. Now, is that revenue framework for manufacturing industry? Is it for a B2B SaaS? Is it for, a franchisee model? They not only ignore context of what works for one company, but they try to replicate that model across every single industry. And that's why they assume growth is linear. And that's far from truth, right? Markets shift, competition, new competition comes into play, customer behavior, customer churn. All of those factors don't exist in predefined models. And I think that's where they overcomplicate simple problems. Instead of focusing on what actually drives revenue and what works and what's worked in the past and accommodate for change, they're enabling a predictable, repeatable model, or they're selling a predictable, repeatable model that doesn't exist because of all the factors, right? It's essentially a false sense of control from a company and organization perspective. Leaderships love them. Like they look good. It's very nice in presentations and they're very good in PowerPoints, but they create an illusion of predictability, just like a gated community, right? Anyone can jump the fence. Right? Like no, like you're not like a gated community is nice, but let's just be real, people can climb over it.
So what is that challenge of when something is sold like a framework, this theory, this idea, this thing that hasn't yet become a reality? What are some of the blockers that maybe prevent it from actually being a reality? What would you say that might be?
One of the most common occurrences of that is the fact that we cannot pivot. It kind of pigeonholes us into thinking about this framework and how this framework is applicable to a business model more so than pivoting and changing based off on marketing conditions. Marketing in today's age is not a defined set of steps. It is a continuously adapting and evolving from a tech perspective, from a people perspective. People learn from a process perspective. And what a framework really does, it confines thought and creativity inside whatever you want to describe it. It could be 7 points, it could be 30 pillars, it could be whatever it is. And that's what people focus on. They say our problem exists in one of these, and we are in this bucket. So we have to solve this problem. But the reality could be far from that truth. And that's, I think, where frameworks don't adapt and can't adapt to the reality of the situation is because, once again, a framework, just like a best practice, is designed to work across every single company at the same time, which, as you know, is impossible. Every
Mhm.
company is different. Even if
Yeah.
it's manufacturing and you're in the manufacturing space, one go to market, one brand, one strategy is very different, even within that space. So it tries to confine it into a siloed area that you need to think out of. And that's, I think, is my biggest kind of problem with frameworks. And it's funny because we have a framework, but once again, our framework doesn't allocate revenue. It shows relationship of activities that occur that correlate to revenue. So it's not saying you use our framework and you're going to get revenue. It's saying, hey, these are all the components that are needed in order to be effective, and these are all the puzzle pieces that we need to focus on.
Yeah, it's almost kind of like instead of trying to focus on ways that revenue could come about for every company because this has been proven once or twice, it kind of makes more sense to focus on what actually drives revenue for an organization, right? What teams are going to be involved in that process? What roles and responsibilities? And I think there's a few things that we wanted to kind of highlight as well on what does actually drive revenue. It's not just a revenue framework or a set of rigid points. There's actually key things that we could see all the time, principles, if you will, that work all the time. So, first one being customer understanding. Why would that help drive revenue?
I mean, I think it's in I think it's in exactly what you said, customer understanding. Like I think bullet point, that's it, underline. Like a framework does not. A framework tells you and focuses on the company, whereas in the modern day marketing world, customer and understanding your customer needs, behaviors, and pain points uh, are crucial to why someone wants to buy your product. It is not people, process, technology, process, workflows, structures. There's components to it, but that's not what it is. You can have the best framework and the best technology. If you don't understand your customer, it's a failing business at that point. And that's when you do, and when you understand what the customer needs is, and you understand those pain points, that's when you can optimize what's working, right? And that's the biggest difference with what's driving revenue. Is it's not the technology. We don't A marketing automation platform, by simply buying it, is not going to make money. It is what you do with the platform, how effectively you do it. That's not going to actually kind of make you money either, realistically. It's understanding who your target audience is, what are the needs, and using that piece of technology to drive engagement, not score, not results, not revenue, not to drive engagement and fulfill that need. That's what optimizing really means.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've kind of seen as a recurring theme is this idea that revenue frameworks in and of themselves are very rigid. And, the kind of opposite of that or the antithesis of that is really being flexible and agile because that's going to be beneficial. If you're finding something is not working in the market, you need to pivot really quickly. Yeah, and people might have a certain kind of feeling on this, but one thing I've noticed with this Starbucks story, if you've seen recently, they have a new CEO. They talk about wait times with their drinks. 4 minutes, 3 minutes, whatever it's going to be. He's been very clear about we need to pivot and pivot quickly and adjust and fix this process as fast as we can. But if you're not open to being flexible or being agile, you're going to be really stuck.
Yeah, and like there's a lot of examples in the market that you can look at, and I think a lot of people try to compare themselves sometimes. So like an Airbnb and a Slack versus like you mentioned, Starbucks. You have to understand the space that you're in. Certain frameworks are really good at a very high level enterprise level because it's going to work no matter what. No one's going to question it, right? Like when you look at a company like Starbucks, frameworks and part of their go to market strategy is investing in a bunch of things that could not work and probably will not work. And trust me, I've worked for for very big enterprise, companies, and their kind of go to market strategy or investment strategy is we have X amount of budget of dollars. We're going to throw it up in the air and we're going to see where it lands on this tech map. And we're going to invest in that. And we're going to see if it works and if it doesn't work. Well, that works maybe for them. So kind of going back to the whole Starbucks topic, right, is when we look at these frameworks and if you look at who's pushing frameworks, there are these, companies from a strategic perspective, and they're targeting these major enterprise organizations like Starbucks,
Would,
Google.
would, would you say that these are big agencies that
No,
they're
they're
that they're
not.
working with?
There are big agencies that they're working with, but I don't think it's the concept or the idea of the big agency, right? I think the idea is that these companies will throw money and invest in a quarterly basis. We're going to use air quotes on invest here, and it will return with absolutely nothing. And the framework will be sold because Google used it or Starbucks used it. In your example from the 4 minute to 3 minute thing, Starbucks is going to make money whether it's 2 minutes or 4 minutes. It's how fast they're making money. That's the concern of the Starbucks CEO. However, we don't have that luxury. We can't invest X amount of dollars, 95% of it fail, and that 5% all of a sudden generates billions of dollars, right? It's a completely different go to market. And what these frameworks do, and when we try to align with these frameworks from a company perspective, we're trying to align with that model and that framework that works for a company that is way far beyond the normal kind of like operating world of the space that we're in. They're designed to give you a false sense of relationship to companies that have so much budget that it does not matter how much of it fails and doesn't fail. They can invest in any framework, but their normal process is still generating revenue.
I think the common theme that we could probably take away, at least on that area, is what actually drives revenue is understanding your customer, optimizing the things that actually work, not just everything for the sake of optimizing, being flexible and agile, and then looking to examples that are in your space as maybe a reference point, but not the end all be all. Those are the things that are really going to make the difference. Using a framework that exhausts 90% of your budget with no return is not going to be the way to go.
Look, if you're not a Google, a version of Google, right? Or if you're not like a Starbucks or a Dunkin', since we're going to go with the coffee metaphors here, really it's print. When we talk about agility, what we're talking about is making decisions based off on data, having iterative cycles of change, and honestly, listening to what your customers are saying.
So maybe the last thought and an important thought is really this idea of getting away from a rigid, structured framework and instead being incredibly agile. And there's a couple of things that I think are important when it comes to being agile around a revenue strategy. And I know you have some principles that you really wanted to kind of tie it off with.
Yeah, I mean, look, at the end of the day, the best revenue strategies are are going to come from understanding your customers, being able to optimize what's working and being able to pivot and adapt to what's not working. There is no framework in current existence that will allow you or give or tell you how to do that. A lot of it is understanding your business. A lot of it is understanding your customers. When we talk about strategic thinking, when we say strategy, that's what we're talking about. We're not a framework isn't going to define that. So realistically, we have to foster kind of a culture of learning from failures, which I know failures are always looked at as a bad thing, right?
Mhm.
But and an iteration and iterative cycles of change. And if you're not doing that, if you're not looking at the end of the quarter, at the end of the month, at the end of the week, however you want to structure it, and you're not saying what worked in this quarter, what didn't work in this quarter, let's see what we can do. What are other possibilities? And you're relying on a framework to say, this is what worked. We're going to just do it next quarter, next quarter, next quarter. It's eventually it's going to come to a point where it's not, you're going to look at it and you're going to say, hey, like what happened? Like what's going on? And no one's going to have an answer to it.
So it almost sounds like, honestly, the revenue framework is very similar to this idea we talked about in an earlier podcast, the art of the possible. right? Where anything is
Yeah.
possible, you can do anything. The reality is, you want to focus on the things that are going to make a difference at the end of the day. So, just to recap some of our key takeaways, I think one thing that we really hit on was that revenue frameworks often fail because of that rigidity, the over complexity, and the fact that you can't really adapt them too often to too many different scenarios, really.
Yeah, and just like I mentioned, like true revenue growth. Sorry, not true revenue, but true revenue growth comes from understanding your customers and optimizing what you need to do to better communicate your message. Like, what is your brand conveying? What is your brand trying to do? All of those items are going to play a better role than a framework that says these are the potholes that you need to fix. Because realistically, a framework is about your company, not about the customer.
So businesses, maybe the last takeaway, businesses should focus less on frameworks and more on building teams that are capable of understanding their customers, optimizing growth, being flexible, being agile, and being responsive to the things that need to happen.
And honestly, one of the simplest forms, if we wanted to do these takeaways, one of the simplest forms that you can implement currently right now is looking at a monthly or quarterly, however you do your reporting, and looking at everything that worked, everything that didn't work, and ask one simple question: why did it work? Why didn't something not work? What do we change for next quarter? A framework is not going to tell you that. It's going to tell you to just do the things that work next quarter, and those things might not be what works in next quarter.
All right. Well, thank you guys for tuning in this week on Call It RevOps, where we dive into this topic. Be sure to check out our previous episodes and stay tuned for more. Have a great day.